Hi there.
Hello,
Can you hear me?
welcome.
Hi, hi,
Yes,
hi, hi. So I'm good. I'm delighted to be here. I'm trusting that you have my deck and that's going to appear somewhere.
yes.
And
Just let me
and
know
do
when
that.
you need
So
it and I can launch it.
yeah. Well, yeah. It won't be in a minute. So hi. Shall I just start?
Yeah.
It was lovely to catch the end of Marlin's presentation and to see kind of sense people's interest. So,
Awesome.
as you know, Artem, I have had the pleasure of we've known each other a while, and I've been on a number of your seminars. And when you asked me this time, would I be interested in taking part, I really had to think about it. I thought, what do I have to say? And it came to me in the end that I something I'm very interested in is not just how we tell stories. I think there's a danger that we get very glib about our profession and that we make it smaller than it is. That we come to be about let's help people tell a good story so that they can X, Y, Z. And sometimes the X, Y, Z is feels worthwhile. Sometimes it feels quite small and unthinking. And what are we actually supporting in helping people tell stories? And I thought how important it is to think about how do we listen to stories, because a story happens in the space between. And so I've come here this afternoon for me, this evening for you, with something that is kind of at the edge of my competence. I'm thinking about this. I'm wondering about it. I've got some thoughts about it I'd like to share and to see how people respond to it and to learn myself from what people say. Um,
Mhm.
so yes, you're right. I will be asking people at some point to listen to a story and to respond, and I've got a particular way I'm going to ask them to do that. So the theme is, and I called it "Listen to the Light: Uncovering the Hidden Gifts of Story." So maybe you could put the deck up, and
Yes.
we'll start with the first slide.
And I will be going into the
Okay,
shadow, so thank you once again for coming,
into the
and
show.
I'm here if you need me.
Okay, all right, and I should be able to move these slides along. Good. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, hello, everyone. I have no idea who everyone is, but hello. Listen to the light, uncovering the hidden gifts of story. I have this sense that how we listen to stories matters as much, if not more, than how they're told. And so I've begun to explore this. I've got some thoughts about the sort of things I want to do, to talk about storytelling and story listening, to talk about different ways of listening to stories and bringing to it both a critical mind and an open heart. I want to make a distinction between what I call degenerative stories and generative stories. That there are certain kinds of story, um, which are, I suppose, they have an agenda. They want something from us. Whereas the generative story offers something to us, a possibility, leaves us with choice, and it's for us to make the sense of it and for us to kind of make meaning from it. Whereas degenerative stories very often are those which are told instrumentally with the intention that we come to a certain conclusion or that we have to believe a certain story in a certain way. So I want to make that distinction about how important it is first to bring a critical mind to the stories we're hearing, and make a judgment about how we should listen. And then when we come to generative stories, particularly I'm very interested in the kind of tacit wisdom that is in some traditional stories. How we can listen to them. How do we listen to them with an open heart? How do we get away from trying to leap to make sense of them too quickly? And this is about thinking with stories as opposed to thinking about stories. I'll say a little bit about that. And then I want to tell you a very short story, 5-minute story. And I'm going to invite you when we come to it to listen to the story, just listen to it. And then I will lead all of us through a little process of inquiry about the story, how we might listen to it with an open heart, how we might come to find meaning for ourselves in the story. And I offer it as a kind of template for how we can think with stories, whether they're personal stories or traditional stories. It's a more holistic way of exploring story. So that's the kind of thing that I want to work through. All right. So my first point is really that stories happen somewhere between the teller and the listener. anyone who's told a story knows this, that you have a story in your mind and you tell it to the best of your ability, and it has certain meanings for you. You have certain feelings about it. And when you offer the story to your audience, it's no longer yours. The meanings of the story happen in the minds and hearts of the listeners. And so storytelling is always relational. It's never something that happens just in the mind of the storyteller. And the spirit in which a story is offered, I think, is a critical thing. And the spirit in which we listen is a critical thing. And getting the right blend so that we don't listen uncritically to stories that want something from us, and we don't try and analyze the hell out of stories that are offered in a more generative way. So somewhere between the teller and the listener. Why I chose to put them on a boat, I don't know. Maybe if the story is told well enough and people listen well enough, they go on a journey. I'm forcing the analogy a bit, but I just like the picture. So two types of story, and I'm making a rather I suppose a distinction, which is not always as clear cut as it might be. But there are stories that are offered with an open hand, so to speak, and stories that are offered almost as a fist. One is closed and one is open, and it's about the intention of the storyteller and the nature of the story itself. And so our first choice, I think, is to decide what kind of story is this? Where's it coming from? And how should we be open to receive it? It's, I think, our critical function that always comes in first. We listen, we've got a little time to say, what kind of story is this? Now, I want to offer you a few thoughts on that. One of which comes from this writer here, a French writer called Christian Salmon. There's a lot of books, as you know, and a lot of practitioners who promote storytelling, and many, unfortunately, promote it rather uncritically. And in the last few years, there have been some really interesting rebuttals, counterblasts, if you like, about the uncritical use of generative stories and the commodification of storytelling, somehow taking storytelling away from its roots of a possible source of wisdom to something that simply tries to create a reality for us for somebody's interests. If you haven't ever come across it, it's a really interesting book. I've recently found two others that are also very new, also critiquing the world of story and storytelling. There's The Crisis of Narration by Byung-Chul Han, which has just come out, and Peter Brooks, who wrote a seminal book on reading for the plot, has now written a book called Seduced by Story, The Use and Abuse of Narrative. So it's one of my particular things, I think, as storytelling practitioners, we need to be cautious and careful in our use of story. It's certainly not uncritical in how we use story. So let me talk about storytelling and truth. It's said by many that we're in the kind of post-truth era. I think that's a slick phrase. But we've always been in a position where stories can serve somebody's purpose. So some stories we hear, whether they're social stories, political stories, organizational stories, family stories even, that are trying to impose a view of the world upon us without necessarily giving us the opportunity to make sense of it for ourselves. And so certain interpretations of the world get marginalized. The classic writer on this is Michel Foucault, French writer. And he talked about regimes of truth and power. So he points out that what is considered to be true, the hegemonic truths, the big truths about the world, are always associated with power. It's just how it seems to happen that in any field academically, the leading academics say something and that is taken to be true. So there's a caution needed when we are told something, particularly when a story tells us that this is the case. This is how to be, this is how to live, this is what to do. Whose interest is it? In whose interest is this story being told? Okay, so Foucault's the first thing. The first question to ask, and when we're trying to think about, is this a story to which I should open myself, then is this being offered in a way that is open-hearted, or is it serving somebody's interest? What is it asking me to do? A second set of ideas which are helpful in this regard, I think, are those of another French philosopher, Jean Baudrillard, who talks about the relationship between a story and the underlying truth of the world it seeks to present. At its best, he says, a story is an authentic attempt to represent the best understanding of an underlying reality that the storyteller has. Given that there's no absolute truth and we can't, define the world absolutely, nonetheless, it's an attempt to tell it like it is. However, many types of stories step back, distance themselves in some way from that clarity. And the first thing he says is what he calls a trace. And that's a story in which certain aspects of reality are diminished or muted or made into euphemisms. A nice example I came across was in a report about biodiversity and species loss, which was very well intentioned, but it couldn't bring itself to name the wonderful creatures that were kind of falling extinct in the oceans. It didn't name the salmon and the parr and the pollock. They talked about a degradation, a loss of biomass. So there's a way in which by using euphemisms, we can step back from the real vibrant truth of it. And it's a storyteller's duty, I think, to tell one story in that clear, honest, vibrant language, not to use euphemisms, not to diminish the existence of something by making it small. Another way he talks about stepping back from the truth is what he calls a void. And that is simply ignoring or not representing a truth in the story. And I'll give you an example from my own culture in the United Kingdom. If you had watched television in the UK in the 1970s and 80s, you would not have known that there were any gay men and women or black men and women in the country other than objects of ridicule and fun. They simply were not part of the public discourse. Even stronger than that, he says, is what he calls a simulacrum. That's a story that bears no relationship to the underlying reality. I'm not going to step into politics here, so I'll choose an example from the realm of sort of finance and industry. And most of you will have come across some years ago the American company called Enron, which had a huge market share value based entirely on fictitious projections of profit, future profit. And it bore absolutely no relationship to its current trading situation and what it was doing. In the end, Enron became a simulacrum, a free-floating story that had nothing whatsoever to do with reality. Okay, that's what I want to say about the first half here is we bring our critical judgment to bear. Why is this story being told to me? What kind of story is it? Is it being told with the kind of honesty and vibrancy of an authentic storyteller, or is there a hidden agenda? Now, let's assume that the story we're going to hear has passed the test. Let's assume that we think this story is being offered in a generative manner, such that it's a gift, and we can and we're encouraged to explore its meaning for ourselves. So how then can we then begin to open ourselves to story in a different way? I first came across this writer, Arthur Frank, some years ago. He's, I guess, a medical sociologist, he would call himself. He's also in remission from cancer. And he writes about how when people have serious medical conditions, their story gets taken from them. They become medicalized. But in this very interesting book, he makes a distinction about thinking about stories and thinking with stories. Thinking about stories, he says, is to hear a story and seek to analyze it, as if you can therefore find the meaning. Thinking with a story is to allow the story to affect you. So how does this story make me feel? What does it say about me and my life? Is there a resonance there rather than an analysis? I found it a very powerful way of coming to look at story. And here again, if you like, it's completely different. He's saying the same thing, but I'm going to tell you the story in a minute. And I want to start, before we do so, by going back to a 13th century poet, Jalaluddin Rumi. And he says, it's a wonderful poem of his called Story Water. And if you haven't read it, then it would be great if you looked it up somewhere and find it in your own language or in English, if that works for you. And these are the last two verses. The whole poem is about what it is to hear a story. I'll read them aloud. I love this. Water, stories, the body, all the things we do are mediums that hide and show what's hidden. Study them and enjoy this being washed with a secret we sometimes know and then not. Being washed with a secret we sometimes know and then not. And I think that's the most gorgeous articulation of a state in which to approach a story, effortlessly, not seeking to understand, not seeking for meaning, allowing the story to wash over and wash through us, and then we'll turn to it. So the great joy of this is it requires no effort as a listener. In fact, it's a kind of setting effortfulness aside. It's simply allowing oneself to be with the story, listening, open, but not a kind of focused, concentrated listening. It's like a kind of soft focus. I suppose there's an analogy with eyesight. You can have a sharp, clear focus where you're laser-like looking at something, or you can have a soft focus where you're allowing things to come into your line of vision. And this is like a soft focus of the mind, allowing the story to wash over and wash through one and see what our imaginations and our bodies do with it. Okay, so now we come to the story that I'm going to tell. It's always nice to hear a story. This story, it comes from South Africa, actually first collected by Sir Lawrence van der Post in his book, The Heart of the Hunter. He calls it the Star Maiden. This is a 5-minute story, and I'm going to ask you simply to open yourself to it. You do nothing except let the story wash over and through you, and afterwards we'll explore it together. And it begins, as all good stories should, once upon a time, on the edge of the dry, dusty Kalahari Desert, there was a bushman farmer. He had some crops and a few cows. And although he was fairly happy, he wished that one day he would have a wife to share his life. One morning, when he went out to milk his cows, he found that they'd already been milked. And he couldn't imagine who had done it. And the next morning when he came out, he found that his cows had already been milked again. So the next night, he decided to hide outside and to discover what was happening. At midnight, he saw something remarkable. Climbing down from the sky, on a ladder that extended between the stars and the earth, was a multitude of star maidens. They each carried a bucket, and as they touched down onto his land, they began to milk the cows. This went on all night long, and as the dawn approached, they began their trip back to the stars, going up the ladder one by one. Just as the last star maiden approached the ladder, the farmer ran out from his hiding place and grabbed hold of her and told her that he wanted to marry her. And the star maiden was open to this idea. They returned together to his farmhouse, and she said to him, "I'm very happy to marry you, and I promise you that your farm will prosper. I have only one condition that I set. I have here a basket. You must promise me never to open the basket. If you do open it, I will leave you." The farmer promised that he would do as she'd asked. The Star Maiden put her basket down in a corner of the room, and their life together began. As his new wife had promised, the farmer's farm and crops prospered, and he became one of the most successful farmers in the whole area. His wife went out into the fields to work every day, and everything that she touched seemed blessed by the gods. He was a very happy man, and as the years passed, he became happier still with his good fortune, for he loved and appreciated the Star Maiden. But one afternoon, when his wife was out in the fields and he was at home looking for something, he found the basket she had put away many years before. Though he remembered what his wife had said, he didn't take it seriously. So he picked up the basket, put it on the table, and opened it up. To his surprise, he found it was empty. He thought this was very funny and had a laugh over the fact that it was empty. He remembered the seriousness with which she'd warned him about not opening her treasure, but still he laughed. A short time later, the Star Maiden came in from the field. As she got into the room, she knew immediately what had happened. And she said to her husband, "A long time ago, I warned you never to open this basket because it was very special to me. I told you also that I would have to leave if you did open it. Well, you violated your oath, and this evening I am going to leave you. I want you to understand the reason for this. I'm not leaving you because you opened up the basket without my permission. After all these years, I would not have minded. I'm leaving you because when you opened the basket, you found nothing in it." And so as night came, the Star Maiden, with great sadness, climbed the ladder back to her home in the sky. Not because he had broken his vow, but because he looked into her most precious possession and could see nothing there. Okay, that's the story. So what I want to do is invite you to kind of be with this story in a particular way. And I'm going to show it to you now. The idea is, and it comes from Goethe, and the idea of Goethean science, sort of phenomenological view of science. How do you have an inquiry about the story, staying close to it? How can we think with the story rather than thinking about the story? And the four elements here of earth, air, water, and fire each offer us a particular way of reflecting on and thinking about the story without rushing to conclusions, without trying to analyze it off the bat. So here's an invitation to you. I will lead us through each of these four sectors in turn, and I will invite you, and you can put it in the chat if you like, or just do it for yourself. And I will share my reflections on it. The first sector, Earth, simply invites us to think about the story and name the elements of the story that struck us, the things in the story, the people in the story. Simply placing them, as it were, on a page, or noticing them in our imagination. What caught our imagination? So for me, the Kalahari Desert was the first, this dry, dusty desert. I was struck by the loneliness of the farmer. The fact that it was midnight when he saw this sky ladder. The Star Maidens. Dawn. The basket. The promise. Good fortune. The gods. The empty basket. His laughter. Nothing. Sadness. Her home in the sky. Those are things that, as I told the story and as I listened to it in the past, have come to me. I'm just placing the parts of the story. I'm doing no more than that. These are images in my mind. These are the images that sprung out of the story and touched me. The second thing to do is to question, not to question of the story, but what questions did the story provoke in your mind? Not answers, what questions did it provoke? So the first one that comes to me is, why on earth did the Star Maiden agree to marry the farmer? What was in it for her? What was it about him that made him a potential husband? Why was the basket empty? Was it empty? What's her home in the sky like? Why did the farmer open the basket? Why couldn't he see anything? If there was something there, what was in the basket? Why was it precious to the Star Maiden? Questions that come up, and just leave them as questions. The third dimension is that of water, and that's about feelings. What feelings came up for you in response to the story? For me, I had a sense of wonder. I think wonder is a kind of feeling. When the Star Maidens appeared, I could imagine that so vividly in my mind, this astonishment, this apparition in the night sky. I felt sad for the loneliness of the farmer. I was puzzled that the Star Maiden said she'd marry him. I was curious about her magic and her ability to bring good fortune. I was anxious when he broke the promise. I was angry on behalf of the Star Maiden, and I felt regret. Why on earth did he do it? Why on earth did he do that? Why did he break it? He had it all, and he broke it. And then finally, now we come to the fourth element, that of fire, and that is the area where we start to say, what did this mean to us, or what meanings did we find in the story? Plural. Some of them that came up for me was that the simplicity of his life brought him close to the sacred. You know, I don't think this would have happened in a town. It happened in the story, in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, people who were close to the earth, and also in that same sense, close to the gods. I was struck by the fact, I had a sense that perhaps his good fortune and love came to him because he was ready. Perhaps if he hadn't been ready, he would never have seen the Star Maidens. Perhaps 100 farmers went out and they weren't open to it, or they didn't see it, but he was ready. I was struck by the generosity, the gift of the feminine, how the feminine comes down to earth and gives to the masculine in this story. And the precious secret of the feminine needs to be respected, even when it's not apparent to the masculine. That seemed to me a significant thing that the story is trying to tell me. That the feminine, the woman, needs her space and her secrets, and that the masculine, the man, shouldn't trespass on those. And I was also struck by the fragility of happiness, that we can have it all and lose it so simply if we don't respect the source. Okay, so those are four ways in which we can think with a story as opposed to just think about the story. And if you're a storyteller, particularly if you're interested in telling wonder tales or traditional stories of any kind, this is a lovely way as a teller to get closer to the story, to your understanding of it, to your ability to bring it to life, and to tell it with passion, and to offer it generously, to offer your vision of the story to others. So a final little thing to think about is what happens next? What might happen next in this story? Is it finished? Is there more to do? What would I do if I was the farmer? And in my imagination, the farmer waits out every night to hope that she will return. And she doesn't. Or if she does, he can't see her until he's a very old man close to his death. And then for one night, he is allowed again to see this vision. And for him, it's enough. He dies happy that his life has been touched by her, and nothing is forgotten. So that's my sense of the story. I don't know what your sense of the story is, and we can't share it in this format. So I said it was an odd thing to do this in this way. But I hope that you can take this simple way, this lovely Goethean way of being with a story, of being open to a story, and then coming back to it and allowing what it means to you, the listener, to emerge, not rushing to find its meaning, but noticing and naming the elements, seeing what it provokes in you by way of curiosity and question, what feelings it arises, and then begin to say, so what might it be about? What sense am I making of these? And then you can also say, yeah, it's really interesting. And where's that story going to go? What might happen next? And as we come up to the end of the time before we Q&A, a couple of things I want to say that are kind of in this same thing. Some of you will know I have a life as a consultant and an academic, but I also have a life as a storyteller of traditional stories. And I tell one particular story called The Storyteller's Tale, which was actually collected and crafted and shaped by an Indian writer called Omer Ahmad. It's a beautiful little novella about a storyteller. It's a love story between a storyteller and the wife of a bandit chief, would you believe? I won't go into it. It takes an hour and a half to tell, and it requires musicians and an interval with beer. But there's a lovely moment in the story where the storyteller, who's quite, what can we say, a bit cynical, and he's been told a story by the woman. He calls her the Begum, which is like the lady of the house. And he's told her a story, and she has told him a story in return, which really deeply challenges him. And he's pacing up and down in his bedroom at night, wondering what to do. Should he leave? Should he stay? How might he return a story to the Begum? And he comes to this realization himself that you're not listening unless you're willing to be changed by what you hear. You're not listening unless you're willing to be changed by what you hear. And that realization for him is enough to shift his response. And instead of trying to be clever, instead of trying to prove how good a storyteller is, he opens his heart to her and he responds to her story. He takes the characters in her story, he turns it round and he gives it back to her. It's a wonderful gesture of reciprocity. And another way of thinking about this, another image, if you like, is this. On the left, or on my left here, is Rainer Maria Rilke, poet. On the right is what's believed to be a statue that once was a statue of Apollo. And Rilke wrote an astonishing poem about this, which is in the Louvre. It's an ancient Greek piece of sculpture. And I'm going to read you the poem because its ending is exactly what I'm talking about. He says, "We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark centre where procreation flared. Otherwise this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not from all the borders of itself burst like a star, for here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life." That last half line comes as an extraordinary message. In light of this apparition of this beauty, which is somehow locked into this ancient statue, his response is not to say, oh, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's extraordinary. His response, talking to himself, is, you must change your life. And I think sometimes that happens to us. And it's good to notice when it does. It happened to me. It happened to me with a story. The first time I ever heard professional storytellers tell a story, I heard the story of the banyan deer, which I write about in the first book that I published. But that story absolutely captured my imagination. And I was 3 minutes into listening to it when I knew I had to learn how to tell stories. And from that night, which is now 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago, it marks a turning point. You must change your life. I have changed my life. I have become a storyteller, a writer, an academic, a consultant. Sometimes when we really listen to a story, that can happen. So I hope I've managed to hold both these ends of the polarity, the critical mind that we must bring to think about, what's this story asking of us? Is it a generative story? Is it one that offers us the possibility to discover meaning for ourselves? Or is it a story that is trying to impose its meaning on us? If our critical judgment allows the story, as it were, being the gatekeeper, then perhaps we can listen with an open heart. And that my offering to you in this workshop really is, when that happens, think about how you might help yourself from rushing to analyze, from rushing to make sense of it. And that little Goethean process of earth, air, water, fire is a delightfully simple and powerful way of staying with the story and letting the meaning, your meaning, its meaning for you emerge. Right, that's got me back to where I started. So I'm going to see if I can stop this doing, put my face on screen, and Artem, I'm going to ask you to see if there are any questions or anything. I hope that made sense. I don't know. I feel so passionately about it.
I'm not here to judge if that made sense. I'm here to ask our audience if they enjoyed the meaning that you offered, and to press fire if they did. And while we are at it, and Laura's here, awesome. Michelle is asking to remind of the name of the book that had the crisis word in it. Can you please remind us what was
the book that I showed? That was Christian Salmon. I can go back to that, I think. Would that be helpful to go back and see if I can find it? No, I've stopped it anyway. It's Christian Salmon.
You mentioned it vocally next to the slide.
Yeah, next to the slide. Okay. Was that the book that I showed?
No, it was. Book, you just mentioned it orally, and it had the word crisis in it.
Oh yes, the crisis of narration. Sorry, that's my dog who's busy narrating. The crisis of narration. I can hold it up. It's by a Korean writer called Byung-Chul Han. Does that show, or is it showing backwards?
Lovely. Yes, yeah, it is
crisis
showing
of
great.
Narration by Byung, and I've just got it. I'm reading it. It's really interesting, and he's talking about the way, as others do, about the way storytelling has become. He calls it story selling, and how that takes story away from its source and away from the nourishment it can give us, and it starts wanting something from us all the time. And that's something to really think about. I think for us as practitioners, are we complicit in this? Are we challenging in that? Are we challenging with our clients? Are we finding ways to offer stories generously and generatively that don't want something from the listener? Don't want us to buy something, don't want us to do something. It's a very fine, it's a good book. The other one I was talking about is this Peter Brooks' Seduced by Story, which is a more literary approach, but still this idea that we've got a bit over storied in a way. It's become what's the word, devalued. We've got story inflation. We've got lots and lots and lots of it, and I think we have to think about that to make sure we don't devalue it. We have something very precious that we work with, but it's easily devalued if we don't think about that. Yeah, that's a very nice message, Michelle. Thank you.
And Michelle is writing about your.
Yes, I can see in that chat. I'm very touched. Lovely. Thank you. Yes. Bless you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I enjoyed writing out the questions. I picked the air perspective and got to questioning myself. Why am I so intrigued by the absence of knowledge of what was in the basket?
Yes. Isn't it a fascinating thing? It's like, I mean, there is no true one answer. That's not what makes it a great story. There is not a simple true answer that's right and wrong. For each of us, that might mean something quite different.
Yeah.
But it's for me, it's very poignant, and I find the sort of the divine feminine has come down to earth and offered something. The divine feminine has come to earth in this story and offered something, and he can't see it. Not only can't he see it, he laughs. Well, of course she goes home. Of course she leaves. Wouldn't you? But I don't know. I'd love to know what would it. Another question is, what would it take to have seen what was in the box? What would it take to have seen what was in the box? What state of mind? How might we have? How might the farmer have seen what's in the box? What does it mean to us? What boxes do we not look in and not see anything? What boxes do we not see? What value do we not appreciate? What precious things do we laugh at?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love how Lenore is writing a totally different approach. I had a woman ask the question about why it took him so long to look, and that is why she left.
Well, that's another story. I mean, she did say don't look. Maybe it was a tease, but I mean, if that's what it means to her, that's right. It could. Why not? It's the meaning of the story is the meaning.
Well, anyway, Geoff, thank you so much for sharing this wisdom with us, and for sharing the different perspectives we can listen to the story. I guess that connects us really. And thank you for sharing the story from South Africa. That's a great connection to our next speaker. But before we do it, I want you to tell me what stories would you like to hear from more people, just like building more lighthouses?
Yeah. I think it will be, I love it when two answers really. One is, I think, to get away from the kind of grandiosity of the story. The simple human story of everyday life is where the richness and value is to be found, I think. Think small. Think small. Dream big and tell small stories. So I think what I've offered today is not wisdom so much as curiosity. It's what making me kind of scratch the inside of my head. So I think there is something really about listening to each other's lives, opening ourselves to each other's everyday life stories. That's what I think. In the end of the day, that's the only thing that heals. The big stories that are laden with beliefs are so often toxic. They want something for us. Yes, thank you. I should write that down and quote myself. Think small, dream big, tell small stories. Yeah, that can be my motto. Yeah, I think that's my
a great recipe for life, right?
It's that kind of question. Yeah, it's that kind of question. That kind of answer. Yeah. Well, as ever, it's been a delight to be here, and I hope that our listeners have found it interesting.
I sure did, and yes, we sure did. Here are the fires raging in the right corner to prove me wrong. To prove me right.
I can see. I see some. Thank you.
Tonight.
It's a great pleasure. Okay, I'm gonna. I think what I'm gonna do is just
thank you so much. Tip
out, and then the next person can come. Can you stop me webcasting, and then someone else? I can stop webcasting.
Yeah. Now that's an exit.